I'd like to hear what each of you thinks about something that Adrian began to touch on, which is the specific, concrete ways in which individuals might become enmeshed in that system. So I know, for example, that in the northeast of England, there's been an experiment with recommending parole on the basis of algorithms. And I also know that several police forces, regional police forces in the UK, have been using facial recognition cameras in trials, and they have a sensitivity of over 90%. They can detect the target person more than 90% of the time, but they also have a false positive rate that's over 90%. So they flag up like 9 innocent people for every 1 person of interest that they detect. And I wonder, in what ways are individuals being affected by this now, and in what ways are they likely to be affected by it in the future? Do you want to start, Gloria?
Yes, I mean, the problem is the more people offend, the more they have a criminal record, if you like, the more vulnerable they are to those kinds of judgments, that they will therefore necessarily do it again. If you pedal it back a bit to the point where they're not necessarily that heavily involved in criminal behavior, the false positive issue is massive. I mean, I don't believe that the pre-crime predictions would ever happen, would ever be at all reliable. There would be far too many false positives. It's only in extreme cases. I did some research many years ago now on dangerousness. There's the concept of dangerousness. So people who are already in prison are in Category A, and Category A prisoners are regarded as dangerous. And when I did this research, it became clear to me that dangerousness meant different things. So some of the IRA were called dangerous, sex offenders were called dangerous, robbers were called dangerous. They were all differently dangerous. But there was only one category of people that are called unconditionally dangerous, who I wouldn't let out of prison. And they were people who killed people, including killing people in prison. So they were a bit like Hannibal Lecter in the movies, if you want to take movies as an example. They were really, really dangerous. But for the rest, there's a huge error inbuilt in those predictions, which I'm uncomfortable with, and I don't envy the sorts of decisions the parole board are expected to make. They're very difficult decisions.
Mark, do you have anything to add?
I think the other way of looking at it, which certainly some police forces would argue is in relation to pre-crime, would be that social interventions could be made at an early stage. So rather than making an intervention to punish crime, actually make an intervention to reshape the potential future history. Now, again, the ethical issues with that are as profound as the other negative view of pre-crime.
Adrian, what would pre-crime in your mind look like in a judicial sense? I mean, presumably we are at some stage talking about a probability.
Well, first, as I was suggesting before, pre-crime, parole, as I understand it, in certain cases, certainly in the US, I'm not so sure in the UK, we are already judging the likelihood of someone to commit a crime in the future when we grant someone parole. If we judge them safe, we are more likely to give them parole, and if we judge them dangerous, we're less likely to grant them parole. So we are already making this judgment. Now, there's a question you can ask, are humans better or worse than what an AI system would do? I mean, Gloria is saying it's difficult because it's a probability and you could be wrong. That's absolutely true, and it's a problem today with human judgment. You have to decide whether or not we're accurate enough to be able to do it. What's useful is that with algorithms, we can at least take a bit of a microscope to them and examine what's going on. And there are a bunch of important questions. So one important question is, okay, once we've got past this point of saying that it's okay to predict future crime in order to make these kinds of decisions, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but as a society we seem to have accepted it. Then it's just a question of, okay, well, how accurately can we predict it? And which factors should we use when making that prediction? So some examples are, if you're male, yes, you're more likely to commit a crime. Is it okay to use that or not? That's a question for society. If you carry a gun, of course you're more likely. What if you come from a poor neighborhood? Or if you're of a certain race? All of those factors are highly predictive in a statistical sense, but is it okay or not to use them?
But we're talking about predicting crime in two very distinct senses, one of which is I predict that there will be in the region of 300 crimes in the vicinity of Wembley come FA Cup final day. But I'm really curious about how one approaches just as a mathematical problem, saying I predict that Mark on Tuesday will walk into a bank and stick him up and walk away with £300,000.
That seems very precise. It sounds like you might have some information, but I would bet against it, I think. But it's when you're trying to make a prediction about an individual, as a general machine learning question, what you would try to do is you're trying to learn from similar sorts of data. And you want to have labeled data if you can. And actually, this does raise many important challenges. So the way that these systems tend to be trained is you have data on a set of people. Often they're people who were arrested, which is how they got into being able to be looked at all. And then they were released, and then you find out how many of them committed a crime which they were caught for in the next 2 or 3 years. And this raises all kinds of important questions, because you're only looking at the subset of the population that was arrested in the first place, you're only looking at those who were then released, and then you're only looking at, about the ones who were then actually caught. And all of that raises important issues. The fact that you have elements of bias in each of those for each of those reasons doesn't mean that you should forget about this data, but you need to try to take that into consideration when you analyze it. And then you look at a new individual and you say, well, how similar are they to people in my data set? And you base your prediction off that.
It's very difficult to do when you're getting down to predicting about people. And those algorithms, for example, black people are disproportionately arrested for sure in the United States. It happens here as well, actually, but let's not go into that. The fact is there's a huge bias in the United States against black people, and they get disproportionately arrested. So the arrest data makes it look as though black people are more criminal, when they're not necessarily, and that data is deeply biased. And to build the algorithm on the back of that kind of data, which is the only data you've actually got, is a massive mistake. And what I think we're doing is replicating in those systems the massive errors that humans are making. So we're just making it worse. Yeah. What we need to do is recognize the biases in our own decision making and try and get better algorithms than we are, not use those massively distorted data that we've distorted.
I'm not so sure that it's a case of looking for better algorithms, but a way of actually being able to interpret them and to use them in an evidence-based way. Statisticians have been working on this problem of subsample bias for many, many years, and you know, there are very, very clear protocols on how to combat that. And I think it's one of the reasons why I make the case that, you know, statisticians, mathematicians should be brought into the party, because there is a wealth of experience dealing with these sorts of issues, such as building a bias, an inherent bias, into a predictive algorithm based on, you know, bias subsampling of a subcomponent of a population.
We've known for a long time that something like 5% of offenders commit 70% of crime, but we don't know which 5%. That's the problem. We can't detect which 5%, and I don't think we'll ever will be able to. It's like trying to predict the movement of an atom. There's too much randomness in the system altogether, along with all those biases and things. Human behavior is not that predictable.
I'd really like to have some questions from the audience. I think we've got a gentleman at the front to start us off.
Extremely interesting. Thank you very much indeed. I learned a lot. I guess the thing that I thought you would talk a little bit more about is identifying the subgroups who have a high prevalence of criminal activity through, for example, what they do online? Because you've talked a bit about physical activity. They go to Wembley and watch football and commit a crime. They like fast cars, they try and break in. But actually a lot of people, I would imagine, actually who look up, the population who look up submachine guns a lot, it is from that group that people are going to do some crime with a weapon. And I guess my question is whether AI is able to harvest the vast amounts of data from the vast numbers of people who are looking at vast numbers of websites and Facebooks and sites and so forth, and actually pick up subgroups who are at high risk. And rather along the lines of community policing, where you go and talk to the guys who are high risk before they go and break into the local bank and see if you can help them a little bit. You've then got people where you could do some preventative things if you could get a high-risk population to target. Is that something that is happening or not? Or
in relation to terrorism, I think, yes, it is. I mean, young people, the security services would monitor websites that are being looked at, and those that are looking at say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS-type websites would be notched up the list of somebody to keep under observation. But it's very difficult to just arrest people on the back of that, because lots of people do it. I mean, students looking at counter-terrorism, for example, would be looking at those websites. So you need more than just that. You need some hard evidence before, and mercifully, I think, before you can prosecute someone in one of our courts.
Gloria,
yes.
you talked about the distinction between opportunistic and professional crime. And I wonder, as half of crime now has migrated onto the web, where the balance between opportunism and professional crime lies, and whether, if it is becoming more professionalized or specialized, that makes the perpetrators harder to catch, and whether it makes it harder to model and predict.
I think it makes it very hard to catch perpetrators, because they could be anywhere. I mean, they could be in Russia, China, anywhere. So that's one of the reasons why I think we really have got to get a grip on controlling the opportunities associated with crime and the internet. In other words, the internet service providers have got to take more responsibility for trying to protect us, as it were, almost from ourselves, but certainly young people particularly. It is inherent in being young that you're curious and you like to take challenges, and you'll see the internet as, can I hack this? And it's fun. And then it's just a hair's breadth away. It's illegal, and it's a hair's breadth away from you ending up in prison. But I don't think young people realise that.
Mark, is anybody using this sort of stochastic methodology that you described for mapping the real world, for mapping patterns of cybercrime?
That I'm not entirely sure of.
I think
there are some in the audience that work in organisations that could probably tell us about that. Maybe Chein, you would know.
I mean, that's one of the projects. That's one of the first projects the Dawes Centre's looking at. We know the mapping and all the rest of it in the real world. How does that translate into the virtual world? And there are some interesting things. For example, dating websites. There are scams associated, romance scams associated with dating websites, But those scams are not uniformly spread across all dating websites. They concentrate on particular websites, significantly concentrate on them. So the question then becomes, well, why is that? Just as a hot spot in burglary in, I don't know, let's say some part of London, you say, well, why is that? And then you get into it, and then you can start to understand it, and then you can start to prevent it. So it's the same on the internet in certain respects. But the short answer is that's what we're learning now through the kind of research that the Dawes Centre at UCL is doing and other universities.
Can I just point out some of the inherent trade-offs that are linked with your good question? So first, there's a clear one that you can immediately see. There's a tension between surveillance and privacy. So do we want to live in a world where all of our online actions are being perused by the state? You can argue either way, depending on what you care more about. But to highlight how it can actually become a bit more nuanced, when you get auto insurance these days, many auto insurers will say, well, if you just put this device in your car, we'll monitor your driving, and if you're a safe driver, we'll charge you a lower insurance premium. And that sounds fair enough. But keep in mind that it's monitoring your driving. With very high likelihood, it'll know if you were drunk driving. It'll know if you were speeding. Should they have a duty to report it to the police? Well, maybe they should, but of course if they do, and if as a consumer you know they're going to do that, you're never going to put it in your car. So there are interesting trade-offs to think about.
May we have another question, please? There's a gentleman here.
Crime is an emotional thing. It's fun. It releases endorphins. And people thoroughly enjoy doing it a lot of the time. Given that it's so emotional, is science a good way of detecting something that emotional? Also, is science a good way of punishing something that emotional?
Mark, would you like to start with that?
I think that the comment that was made that human behaviour is incredibly complex, and it's difficult to predict with any degree of precision.
But it's not just the prediction; it's also the detection and the punishment. You were talking about, how you work out what level of punishment, what level of going up, sort of post punishment, is needed. But if you know that if somebody's getting a kick out of it, and if it's fun, how on earth can you use science to monitor that?
Why not?
Yeah, exactly. Why not?
I mean, there are all sorts of ways of having fun. You don't have to go out and mug somebody. Kind of push them in a different direction. Lots of the when I was a kid, many years ago in Liverpool, lots of the blokes I knew used to go mountaineering. I wasn't going to go. It was a ridiculous thing to do, but they liked it. That's the thing about blokes. But they didn't go out mugging people. Not my friends anyway, but other people do. I mean, it's what you've got. Yes, we like to have fun, but we don't all go out and commit a crime to get it, as it were. Actually, just to backtrack slightly on that, you're right in relation to car crime. In the 1980s, theft of vehicles was the highest in this country, the highest in Europe. It was huge, and it was called joyriding, and the kids nicked the car because it was enormous fun. Once the manufacturers put deadlocks and immobilizers on vehicles, it was damn nigh impossible for those kids, the opportunistic offenders, to nick the cars to have fun, so it stopped. And the drop of 70% in car crime is largely those opportunistic kids who were joyriding. The professional car thieves have carried on stealing cars by stealing the keys or doing a give me your car thing with a knife or a gun or something. They haven't stopped. But the fun bit has. And the kids have gone off to play on the internet and done something else, but they've stopped nicking cars.
I suppose as well, your point about shutting down the opportunities for crime partially touches on the fun element, because if you have to be applying a very complicated piece of malware.
Exactly.
Then,
I mean, if it isn't the opportunistic offenders do it because it's there and, oh, great, let's do it. If you've got to think about it and plan it and work it out and buy a gun and go to the bank and go like, that's not fun. That's scary.
But that's a tiny proportion of what people...
Yes, it is. So most of them are just opportunistic and they're very easily deterred.
We've got a gentleman at the front.
Yes, it would be to expand on this one. So 70% of crime went down because of the opportunists were pushed away. And my question would be, the solution rate of those who are professional, did it went up? Did it go up for the reason that it freed up resources of the police, of law enforcement, or not? Do you have the statistic?
I don't know about the UK because we cut police numbers. But in parts of Australia and New Zealand, where the bulk of crime has dropped significantly, the police detection rates have started to go up. I don't think there's any evidence of that happening here. But in New Zealand, they increased police numbers. I mean, this is all very political, and I'm not necessarily making a case for that one way or the other, but the evidence from New Zealand, where they've gone a bundle on prevention in a very well-controlled way, the police and the rest of New Zealand people as well, has been very effective. Crime's dropped there. Crime's dropped across the world in all sorts of advanced Western democracies. But there is starting to be some evidence from parts of New South Wales and New Zealand particularly of increased detection rates, if that was your question.
Yeah, yes, thank you. And another question very quickly, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah, crime, opportunity, means, and motive. I have a motive. I go to commit a crime, you predict it, and suddenly sun shines I got some endorphins, and I don't want to do it anymore, for whatever reason. So my motive is 0, therefore crime will not be committed. But the system you predict, you developed would predict me to rob the bank on Tuesday at 2 p.m. So how that would work? And a question to young gentleman, because he was proponent of the punishing people for predicting.
Me?
No, your neighbor, yeah.
The young gentleman.
Sorry?
You raise the hand,
yeah, I can,
saying let's do it. So
I can answer that quickly now, and then Adrian can address your second question. I raise my hand because we already do punish people for crimes we think they're likely to commit in the future, and I think that is justifiable under certain circumstances. I don't think we should do it all the time. I certainly don't think we should arrest people because the algorithm says they've got a 64% probability of domestic violence, but I think there are certain circumstances where if people are a threat to the public or to somebody close to them, then you can argue it's legitimate. But Adrian, you'd like to...
Well, in the young gentleman's defense...
I'm very flattered.
Our current system does do this. As I highlighted, the sentencing guidelines say we have to do that. So if we don't like that, we should change the system. So it's important for us to know, because many of us don't know that. To answer your question, I think that it's a classic problem of potentially the algorithm not taking enough things into consideration. You're never going to have every factor feed into your algorithm, and if whether the sun is shining happens to be an important factor, and you're leaving that out, then you're going to go wrong. Last thing I'd say is that we've generally heard views here that tend to be suggesting that it's a bad thing to be making these predictions and to be acting accordingly. But just keep in mind that the alternative is not to make any prediction at all, to treat everybody equally, and given that we have limited resources, we have limited police resources, limited prisons, treating everybody as exactly identical is not an effective way to use those limited resources. It'll likely, statistically for sure, likely to result in a worse outcome for society. So it's something to keep in mind.
We had a question there.
So with modern AI techniques, we've got things like differential evolution and dealing with the optimization problem. Why couldn't we utilize the idea of searching for all feasible solutions and an AI picking out, say, 2 or 3 that it feels are the most suitable or the most suitable responses, and then maybe using human validation after that point to choose which of those 3 or 4 options are the best? That sort of way, taking the best of both. Why are we arguing either AI or human? Why couldn't we have an amalgamation?
Mark, I'm going to bring...
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, and perhaps we haven't made it clear that these AI-type forecasts or predictions are a tool, an aid for the intelligence analysts, the police to, accumulate this evidence and then to help make decisions too. As Adrian mentioned, the number of resources in policing is shrinking, so anything that helps that process will be worthwhile. But I think to just automatically and naively assume that we have an algorithm, it's going to tell us what to do, and we don't have to question it or think about it, isn't right. What you describe is exactly what I think we're aiming for, is that in tandem with these tools, we become more effective in our reasoning and in the execution of whatever decisions happen to be made.
Can I just add something quickly?
Sorry, yes, of course.
So first you raise an excellent point, which is we shouldn't consider these systems in isolation. We really need to consider how they are used in society. And what you're describing is it's sometimes thought as the difference between AI, which is artificial intelligence, and IA, which is intelligence augmentation of a human. These are decision augmentation systems, and they should be designed to help a human make a decision most effectively. But just one other thing to keep in mind, another phrase people use is human in the loop, that you should keep a human in the loop because, for various reasons, because we want to include human judgment, or perhaps it is unfair to the dignity of a human to receive sentencing by an algorithm, various factors like that. So often a human is inserted into the process to be involved. But we need to keep in mind that over time, if algorithms are predicting with high accuracy and the human is essentially just rubber stamping what the algorithm says, over time, human starts to become quite unconfident about challenging the algorithm, and there can be a sense of technological enfeeblement of the human, and the algorithms are starting to get accepted more and more. So that's just another point to keep in mind.
Facial recognition as an algorithm for detecting criminals. What other options are there, and can you stack these algorithms together to get a better answer?
Mark, would you like to start?
The answer is yes, that there are approaches where you would take a number of different predictions, and based on the weight of evidence supporting those, you can combine them to lower the risk of making an incorrect prediction. These are very classical tools in Bayesian statistics, for example, where you would accumulate evidence and you would weight it accordingly to the quality of that evidence. So that's something that's well known, and many AI systems actually use that.
One issue we haven't talked about really tonight is China as the great, hungry consumer of AI research, but also the great testbed for a lot of these technologies where they're being deployed for the first time. And I believe that in Xinjiang province, where there's been an issue with the Uyghur separatist movement, the authorities have already begun using predictive modeling to certainly to allocate police resources, but also, I believe, to make arrests. So it sounds as though it's something, I mean, Lord only knows if the underlying maths is good or not, but it sounds as though it's already being realised.
Well, that's scary then.
We have another question, just at the back.
Thank you. The focus of this discussion seems depressingly narrow in the sense that we seem to be talking almost entirely about analysing where crime is being committed, or looking at the people who commit crimes or are likely to commit crimes. And I wonder whether it might be more fruitful to look at where crime isn't being committed, or to look at people who are not committing crimes. When I was a young sociologist, there were a number of obvious correlations between social impacts and crime. Education is a very obvious one, but street lighting is another, maybe less obvious one, that actually, maybe unsurprisingly, where street lighting is available, crime is less. So I wonder whether it might be that there's a bit of confirmation bias here, that we're looking at people who are likely to commit crimes or who commit crimes, and perhaps it might be more fruitful to think about why. The point about joyriding is one of the obvious reasons why joyriding has declined is it's a lot harder to nick a car now than it was just a few years ago. It's actually hot wiring a car is not an easy thing to do anymore. So I wonder whether actually looking at why people don't commit crimes, or either because of personal motivation or social inhibition, might be a more fruitful way of rather than focusing simply on the rather narrow notion of people who do.
Particularly since some people find it quite fun.
I mean, I think people don't commit crime where there are no opportunities to do so. And the more opportunities there are, the more people will commit crime. And I think I'm always slightly uncomfortable linking crime to social deprivation. I do understand the arguments, but there are an awful lot of poor people who don't commit crime. I mean, picking up your point about people who don't do things. And there are an awful lot of rich people who do. And they're very well educated rich people. Yeah, okay, well, there are very well-educated people who commit crimes. I mean, I'm thinking bankers off the top of my head. Not
Journalists.
Sorry?
Journalists.
Journalists. I mean,
Are they educated?
Thinking presidents. I mean, it's got nothing to do with, necessarily, with lack of education or poverty. Oh, well, I mean, I don't get too provocative about things like that. There are presidents and presidents. I can think of more than one that I wouldn't want to live in their country.
I think we can squeeze in one last question, so please make it a good one, yes.
Sure.
I'd like to ask, in terms of rehabilitation, not very favourable at the moment, but I think it's very important, rehabilitation. If we have a statistical basis for saying people are going to commit crime, does it make it more difficult then to get people to come out of crime? Can they defend it by the fact that they are statistically more likely and use that as a base and reject free will?
If I can do that. We've just done a whole pile of research on what works in crime reduction, and there's been a lot done on treatment programs. Most of them have not been terribly successful. And to some extent, I think that's because they haven't been given a fair try. I mean, I worked for 10 years in prisons, a long time ago, admittedly. The prison population is now at least twice what it was when I worked in Wormwood Scrubs. And then, even then, the treatment options available to prisoners was restricted. The education programs were not generous. The training programs were not great. It is almost impossible these days with the prison overcrowding program to plausibly claim that people are being rehabilitated in prison. They simply are not. But having said that, even some of the best attempts at treatment programs aren't terribly effective. Changing people is really difficult. Changing situations is not. And that's one of the reasons why I stress the opportunities in relation to causing crime. And that's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about the unfettered and hugely rapid growth of technologies without us thinking we've got to control the opportunities these are going to provide for crime. A lot of the discussion tonight's been about individuals, about predicting what people are going to do, instead of, and I'm going to go back to my opening statement, my prediction is the crime will go up on the back of these new technologies. And that's nothing about people, because we're all prone to temptation. That's the problem.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank the audience for some really excellent testing questions, and the panelists for a series of very informative presentations, but also, I think, a really healthy tension of opinions in some cases. I've very much enjoyed this evening. And I think all that remains is to say, if you're the person who is about to go and steal the e-registration Ford Cortina that I left outside, please don't. Thank you very much.